We have to think, if you were a newly freed enslaved person and you had no control over your work schedule, and now you're being told that the creator of the universe is giving you a day that you had to rest, this would be such a gift. And my family, was held here as slaves. I have ancestors who could not rest. My grandmother, who took me out of foster care as a young woman, picked cotton as a sharecropper. So for me, when I rest, I'm stopping, but I'm also making a radical stand that says my body as a Black woman is important and it deserves rest. And I'm not only what I can produce, I'm who I am. I have inherent worth, even if I'm not producing. And I understand that in this world, there are people who cannot do Sabbath, whether they're essential workers during COVID, whether they're people who are undocumented that also don't, they have to come to work whenever their boss tells them to. So we're not at a place where every single human being can have a day of rest, but I hope and pray for the day where we have that.
Welcome to another episode of the Hope Strategy Podcast. Corey Blake here with Josh Steinley. We just had an amazing conversation with Onleilove Chika Alston. And yes, her name is Onleilove. It is not a name that she came up with afterwards. It is the name that her parents gave her. It's a beautiful name for a beautiful person, and really loved our conversation that we had with her.
We are getting some unique people on this podcast, and this is an example of somebody that I don't know if we ever would have met in this life except for this podcast. And yet we talked to her and I think, wow, this is so fascinating. Now I can't imagine not having met her.
I couldn't hold back telling her that I loved her at the end. It was like, I really like the light that she had, and also the bridges that the gaps that she bridged for me in that one conversation of just realizing, and really I stayed up I was like, I got to do some research, for this interview, and it's late and whatever, but I really want to be prepared. And I got sucked into multiple hour-long interviews and things that she had done. And I'm like, the whole time I'm listening to it, I'm just like, like I said, she's bridging so many gaps for me that I just wouldn't know unless I saw it and heard it from my own personal beliefs and my own understanding. And then hearing somebody from a completely different walk of life who believes so many of the same things, and not only believes them, but has studied them so thoroughly, and can speak to them in a way that I can't. Like, I was just like, man, this is fascinating. So I really loved it. That was so great.
Yeah. And there's some fascinating stuff in there that I've never heard before, like this Limba group and stuff, and Israelites spread throughout Africa. It's like, wow, that's a whole rabbit hole we could go down. That would just be fascinating. I'm ready to read a book on that. I want to see a documentary on that. Like, I want to know all that stuff because...
And she knows it. She's like the expert on it. She's one of she wrote the book literally. Like, I think she's one that, we look at having back on and talking to, or even just a separate conversation to be educated. I would love to hear, like, when she started talking in the videos I was watching last night about, the scattering of the 10 tribes and how one of the signs of the times is those 10 tribes coming together, like all things that we know and believe and hear all the time. But from her perspective as an African American theologist and minister who understands these things differently and looks at it through a different lens, I was like, man, because I've heard throughout my life that there's people out there that believe that Christ was African, that he was Black, that he, and it's kind of just like, oh, whatever. I don't know. I have no idea. But when she starts talking about it, you're like, man, this is so good. Like she has such a great perspective. I'm going to read part of her bio. Again, some of these bios, you're just like, man, like they've done so much. How are people doing so much? It's so inspiring. But so she's the founder of Prophetic Whirlwind Ministries, dedicated to uncovering the African roots of the Bible, combating gender violence, and supporting African Jews. In April 2019, her first book, Prophetic Whirlwind, Uncovering the Black Biblical Destiny, was published. As the organizer for Urban Youth Alliance International Bronx Connect, she is helping to build and organizing an advocacy program that organizes court-involved youth as well as faith leaders as their allies to keep youth out of jail for life. She's also the co-founder of Daughters for Justice, an organization of women clergy dedicated to radical justice in New York City. Born and raised in East New York. Over a decade, she's worked as a faith-rooted community organizer and advocate. She's been on the front lines for so many, and an advocate for so many movements that have taken place over the last couple of years. She has amazing perspective. And I think more than anything, her perspective, and it's very uplifting to listen to somebody from the front lines of many movements that have taken place over the last couple of years and who has seen so much injustice in her life to be hopeful. To hear somebody that sees that and recognizes it, but then to be able to tell all of the reasons that they still have hope is inspiring and uplifting in a time that is difficult. And there's a lot of unknown.
For sure. I mean, we're recording this right after the
Literally
riots
1 week,
at the Capitol.
7 days after the riots. Yep.
Yeah. So this is kind of a crazy time as we're recording this, and you'll hear a bunch of that in the episode, but it's funny because when COVID broke out, we were saying people need hope. And I thought, well, that's kind of the peak of despair, was like March, April, May last year. And now after everything that's going on politically, I'm like, here's our second peak. And it's COVID, it's the craziness with politics and the divisiveness with every side. I mean, it's not one side, it's both sides are dividing us. And I felt like this was a great coming together thing because, I mean, you and I, Corey, we lean more conservative, socially conservative and stuff, and she's more socially liberal. And yet we agreed on so many things in here. And it seems like the news media and the talking heads, they want to focus on that little bit that we disagree on and divide us so they can make money off of us. But if we can come together and talk like this, we can see, gee, we really agree on most things.
Yeah.
Let's focus on that. Let's work on that and make some progress there. Then we can work out that tiny stuff. Seriously.
Like, people need to listen to this. They need to hear this. If you haven't heard a perspective from someone like Onleilove, you really need to listen to this. We did our best, and nothing to be said for us. We did our best to navigate the conversation and glean as much from it as we could. These conversations that we have with such intelligent, smart people that are so giving of their time with us, I'm like, the biggest thing is, how do I get as much as I can in an hour? So we're trying to ask the right questions and do our very best. And we really, really listen to this one and share it and share some of your perspectives on it, because I think this is her message generally is one that is beneficial. And if you listen to more of the stuff she says in this interview and our other stuff, you'll be better for it. So please enjoy this amazing conversation with Onlilove Alston.
Something is happening in our world.
Time is very precious.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
Hope in the face of difficulty.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Hope in the face of uncertainty.
I'm better now than I was. I'm experienced now.
Changing the world can happen anywhere, and anyone can do it.
The audacity of hope.
This is the Hope Strategy Podcast with Corey Blake and Josh Steinley. I couldn't be more excited to talk to you specifically. I will tell you, last night that I fell asleep at 1 a.m. on the couch watching YouTube videos of yours. And
oh boy, Corey.
I got home last night. It was a long day, and I told my wife, I'm like, I've got 2 interviews tomorrow. I'm real prepped for one, and I'm not for the other one yet. So I've got a lot to. So I started reading, and I read your bio, and I went through everything, and then I said, I'm gonna go sit on the couch and at 11, and I started watching interviews you've done, and what do we call it, like sermons that you've given, and I woke up at 6 a.m. on the couch and went in to get the kids ready for school, and I was like, I am pumped to talk to Onleilove, if nothing else, just to say your name a bunch, because it's a wonderful name.
Thank you for having me, Corey. And this podcast sounds like something that's really needed right now.
Yeah.
In our nation and in our world. Really, really needed.
Yeah, I agree. I want to look at the different ways that we can approach this conversation, because your knowledge and expertise on the Bible is unbelievable. The things you were talking about with the tribes of Israel and the matriarchy throughout the Bible, and so many different things that I was just like, man, we could talk about that all day. Like we love this stuff. Go ahead.
I was doing my prep, and I was looking at like how you were talking about Jews in Africa, and I was in Israel a couple of years ago, and I have friends in Israel, and they were telling me all about, like, in Ethiopia, how there was this huge community of Jewish people in Ethiopia, and they did like a plane lift to take them out of there when there was a war and stuff. And I was like, I had no idea about this stuff. I'm like, well, where did they come from? And he's like, a couple thousand years ago, a bunch of Jewish people went to Africa, and then we got separated, and then they found them. And it's like, that's amazing. Like, how come I've never heard of this before? So
yes, that is, I've been to Israel as well, but that story is like, I just love that part of my work because it does have so much hope in it, especially for now when, you know, hate is increasing, but it has a lot of hope in it.
I want to make sure that we have time to get into a lot of your expertise, knowledge. I want to tap into that the best that we possibly can, but we always like to start at the beginning. And I know that your story from beginning to end is inspiring and hopeful. And so I want to start with your upbringing. You grew up in New York City, and tell us about what your upbringing was like. I know that's a loaded question because there's a lot to go into it, but I want to hear all about it.
I was born and raised mostly in East New York, Brooklyn. But when I was about 6, we moved to Queens. My mother and father remarried, and I had a pretty normal childhood. But when I was about 7, my stepfather lost his job and my family lost our house, and we went into the homeless system like so many families in the 80s, I would later find out. And within that year of homelessness, my little brother and I were taken into first traditional foster care, and then my grandmother and aunt got us into kinship foster care, where we remained for the rest of our childhood, but we were able to still, stay connected to our family. But that kind of incident early on really impacted like how I saw the world, understanding what injustice really does, understanding the whole importance of reuniting families that are broken apart. And that kind of, I think, even played a role in my research and writings about, Jews in Africa and their journey to reconnect. And so, I was not raised in an overly religious family, but at 10, I started praying and reading the Psalms morning, noon, and night. And then at 14, joined an African-American Baptist church. And because of school and different things I saw, I thought like all churches were like Dr. King. Mm-hmm. And my first pastor was very involved in the community. And it was nothing for like our congressman Ed Towns to come, or to hear my pastor on a Sunday preaching about a justice issue in the community. And when I went to college, to Penn State, though, I noticed that, my spiritual experience was very unique, and that there were some people who used their religious beliefs to actually preach hate and preach division. And I think, in all honesty, and I could say this as an ordained minister and someone who went to seminary and is a faith leader, like right now, we're seeing some of the fallout from, preaching beliefs that don't lead to hope, but that lead to division. But because I had this early experience with injustice, someone I look up to, Archbishop E. Bernard Jordan, he says, in the wound, in the affliction is actually where a lot of faith leaders get their gifting from, because now it's my orientation is to look at things through the lens of the least of these, or through the lens of the marginalized, mm-hmm. or, so it was very easy for me to think about, hey, why is no one, or not, no, there are many people actually, but it's very easy for me to think about, how does anti-Semitism impact African Jews? or, they may be disconnected from, the rest of the faith community. How do we get them reconnected? Or to think, through the eyes of other marginalized groups because of that experience I had. So I don't want any other child to have that experience. And as someone who does advocacy and organizing with court-involved youth, and I've worked with the Administration of Children's Services in New York as an advocate with high level all the way up to the commissioner as recent as this summer, I work tirelessly to say, no other child in the richest nation in the world should have to experience homelessness. Or, when you look at foster care in this country, you actually have a pattern of Native American and Black children being wrongfully removed. So I was removed mostly due to poverty. And Malcolm X's family, after his father was killed for being an organizer with the United Negro Improvement Association, which was founded by Marcus Garvey, whose speech is the title for my book. His mom had a mental breakdown and they were put in foster care. People don't know that.
I just finished reading Malcolm X's autobiography. It's fascinating. And yeah, he's not too keen on, well, I shouldn't say the foster system, but he wasn't too keen on the foster system that took him away from his family.
Yes. And so you really see in his story how systematic racism and even his father's persecution for being an activist led his family into that system. And so, yes, I fight to rectify that system, but I also recognize that even in the pain of that, there was a gift of hope that was given to me because I can see through the lens of the marginalized. And so that's a little bit about my background.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we've talked a lot on the podcast with the amazing people that we've spoken with about the role that empathy plays in progress or in helping others. Or one thing that I'm interested in, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of this, but you as somebody who was in the foster care system, who saw the way that it broke down, the way that it was a disservice to you and your family, I'm sure, maybe not holistically, but at least a big part of it. But then to go on to come out of that system, remind me again so you have you got your bachelor's degree at Penn State, but you're also, like you said, an ordained minister and you went to seminary. And then do you have a PhD or
So I did a dual master's at Columbia University and Union Theological Seminary. And Union is where the professor who's kind of the founder of Black liberation theology taught, Dr. James Cone. And then did some other programs at Yale and Duke. But recently, because of my book research, which was about 6 years on the ground in Africa and Israel, and then going through the archives at the Schomburg Research Center for African American Culture. That's a mouthful, but it has the biggest collection of writings on African and African American Jews in the world. It even has photos from the Israeli chapter of the Black Panther Party, which also included Mizrahi Jews, Middle Eastern Jews. I have an honorary doctorate from Zoe Life Theological College, an accredited school in Nigeria and India, where I've done some ministry. So I am enrolling in an official doctorate program, hopefully soon. That was a little slowed down by all the changes because of COVID, but yeah. So a lot of more degrees in a thermometer. I love to learn, but I'm grateful for the journey I've been on.
Yeah. So you took this. So what I was getting at is you took this experience, this life experience, and rather than having it be something that weighed you down and kept you down, it seems to me, and one of the trends I've seen with people that have gone on to take these experiences and then transition them into success stories. And then past even success stories, not personal success, but service-oriented success, where they're trying their best to help people get out of the situations they were in, is you went on and got an education, and then you've immediately looked back to the community and said, how can I continue to strengthen the community? How can I continue to better myself and educate myself to be a resource and an advocate for people who are in similar situations to myself? What is the driver for that? What for you personally, what is the motivation and driver to say, I'm not just going to look at myself and how I can be better and get myself out of this, but I'm going to look back to where I come from and use what I've learned to help others?
So there's a couple of things because, in America, we have this pull yourself up by your bootstraps myth, which is not true. So I think some of the things that helped me was being taken in from traditional foster care to with my family and still being able to keep, some connection to my parents, even though there was still a lot of pain. And I remember the day that I was, brought to my grandmother's house, and the name my father gave me is Chika. So my full name is Onlilove Chika Alston. Chika, I would later find out in the Igbo language, which Henry Kissinger called them the Jews of Africa. They're one of the groups that I research and work with. Chika means God is supreme or God is above all. But I didn't know growing up, this name was almost like it kind of set me on my journey because the Igbos are one of the African Jewish groups I work with the most. But being, when I was taken back into my family actually, they put me in a new dress. They got my hair done. And they were like, it was almost like, and then they were like, okay, we have Chika back. And it was almost like as a little girl, I was very fortunate before we were taken into foster care. So I was a little spoiled, I guess what people would call, but, and then to lose everything. So, just lose, and then to have your family take you back in and dress you up and re-embrace you. That was one thing that will always stick with me because when I returned to the village in Nigeria, my family being owned by one of the top 10 slave owning families in the country, the Alstons, which has a book and a documentary. When I was welcomed back to the village, the Igbo village that lost the highest number of people to slavery, and the king welcomed me back and I was dressed in a traditional attire. It was like another time when my dignity was restored. So having people around me that restored my dignity, but also my faith played a huge role. The way I look at the story of Jesus or Yeshua is good news to the poor, the least of these. So that was already in me. But third, I did have about from my teenage years to a little bit after college of depression because all of the trauma of what had happened to my family began to hit me. And when I went to Penn State, because it was so quiet, it's in the middle of farm country, when you're kind of out of the hustle and bustle of a city, things may hit you. So I want to be transparent that, my grandmother came to me when she noticed a change in my behavior. And she said, Chika, you probably should go to therapy. And, teenagers, I was like, teenagers just whatever. But when I was in college, I put myself in therapy. And I continuously keep myself in therapy, especially this year with COVID, because being a faith leader, being an advocate, being a Black woman. So I say all of that to say, my story is not just a miraculous, like, oh, how did she triumph? I had a lot of support. I, did go through a bout of depression, but it was normal because, when you go through trauma, you're going to hold that trauma. So I don't think there's any shame in going for mental health counseling or, I've utilized health coaches. I think one thing with me is I've learned to utilize help in community, whether it's family, whether it's faith community, whether it's setting up, opportunities where I can be poured into. And I think, that has helped me maintain hope, and so those are some of the things that really helped me. But it was never a question of, was I going to look back to my community? When I went to college, it's just also a cultural thing where you don't only think about yourself, but you think about those behind you. So it was always like, why would I go to farm country to study, not to go back and, help my community? That's just something, I guess, that was also ingrained in me from a lot of different sources and just from the culture.
Yeah, that's one thing you said. One other theme that comes up often is ego, and the way that ego can get in the way of progress or get in the way of hope or supporting others or whatever. I think the first step, and one of the things that we think of a lot with with ego is forgetting yourself, right? And being able to, be humble, basically. The next step to that, though, and is, in my opinion, is not just to forget yourself, but then to look outwards in service of others. And what people, the more and more people we speak with, the more I see that those, and we strive to do this ourselves, but those that look outside of themselves and serve others, just like you said, as you've studied the life of Jesus, that was his ministry, right? Is to be there for those that don't have and to support them and uplift them and to serve them. I guess what role has service and serving people around you? How has that helped you find hope? And how has that maybe helped you, even looking outside of yourself, help serve depression and anxiety? Something we've talked about quite a bit on the podcast.
Yeah. So I think definitely when you look outside of yourself and you look outside of your ego, it helps you. I think when folks feel like there's no one they can help, then that can be very isolating. And I don't believe really in isolation. Like, I am I am me, but I'm also my ancestors. I'm also my descendants. And I think even in high school, like I went to the high school for leadership and public service. So obviously we had to do like hundreds of hours of service to even graduate. Like, I know people that had great grades who did not graduate because their service hours weren't up to par. So, but I also, in my faith, learning it is better to give than receive. And even in college, when I was struggling with depression, when there were incidents of racism at Penn State that my friends were going through, I still participated in activism to the level that I could, because I had love for my community. And that also reminded me, okay, you may be struggling, but there's something of value that's within you. I don't think you have to be perfect to help or to look outside of others. And then, currently, even in all this, the difficulty of 2020 and now 2021, even though I may not be able to physically go and help someone, just even setting up virtual community for folks has been really helpful for me.
Yeah, I think that's a common misconception with service or looking outside of yourself is, well, I'm not there yet. So when I get there, as soon as I get there, I'm going to go ahead and help other people. But the ability to recognize that we're all on the same journey, right? We're all trying to figure this out. Nobody is perfect. We all have our own personal struggles or familial struggles or whatever it might be. It actually benefits you and your personal struggles as you serve other people. When a lot of times you would think that that's the impediment to actually serving other people. It's like, well, no, do that. And then you'll feel better about yourself. And then you'll be able to work on yourself a little bit more. And you'll also gain perspective as you see other people's perspective.
And also the people that you help, they'll see that they don't have to be perfect to be a servant. I think that's why Yeshua said the greatest among you will be a servant. Now, when he said that, let's be mindful, because we think Messiah, but he was a poor Jewish man under Roman occupation. He was not sitting on any throne of Judah, because it really didn't exist at that time. This is after the Maccabean revolt and many other revolts, but yet he's walking around telling poor people, blessed, the greatest among you will be a servant. So even in his life, we're seeing, you don't have to have it. I mean, at one point he said he was homeless, but he still had a great impact. Or if you can even look at other religious leaders. Dr. King was like 25 when he did 25. I get, because I think he looks a little older than but when you read the ages and what he did, I'm like, man, this is a kid. Yeah. He would be on TikTok if he was alive today, maybe saying his little speeches on, but he was able to do so much. But he also struggled with suicidal thoughts that his wife, Mahalia Jackson, had to call him, talk him out of. I mean, literally, he struggled. He had his own struggles, but look at the impact he's still making. So I definitely think I'm one that believes in you heal while you fulfill your purpose. I don't believe you heal and then you go out to fulfill your purpose. I'm not a believer in that.
I agree with you 100%. And I remember in college, I studied international culture studies, communications, and anthropology being the emphasis. And one of my class, I can't remember which one it was, but we did a whole, section or whatever on Martin Luther King. And we did, I think it was I can't remember what the class was, doesn't matter. But I remember at that time, I was probably 25 or 26, a little bit later in school. And I took my time. I got a master's degree and a bachelor, I guess, in a bachelor's degree. It took me that long. But I remember reading Dr. King's speeches and his writings, and I was blown away that he was my age. And that moment of realization, like, oh man, this guy, and just feeling so inspired and feeling overwhelmed with the impact that he had in the short life that he lived, but also what he did at such a young age. And to bring up the fact that he struggled with suicidal thoughts and depression, anxiety. You look at like Abraham Lincoln, same thing, right? He struggled his entire life with severe depression and anxiety and these thoughts. And to be able to recognize that some of the greatest among us are those that, that have struggled the most and were able to look outside themselves throughout that whole process is pretty inspiring. I want to understand the best that I can, and I want the audience to understand your, I guess we'll call it, we'll go not spiritual, but your religious transition, because you mentioned the beginning of that transition, which I was inspired by, and when I watched and read, about you, that experience that you had as a 14-year-old, where you basically were converted to follow Jesus Christ as you tell me the names that you use now, because I'm not familiar with the.
Yeah, the English names that most people know Jesus by is Jesus or Christ. Mm-hmm. I try to, I think one of the biggest injustices in like Western Christianity is separating Jesus from his Jewish heritage or his Hebrew heritage. And I think that has directly led to anti-Semitism and racism and a lot of injustices, because theology is so important. And so what I try to do to really remember that Jesus was a man born to, a teenage mother, that he came from a people, he lived in a land, is I try to call him by his Hebrew or Aramaic name. So some people pronounce it as Yahshua or Yeshua. Yeshua is Aramaic, and that was the common language of the day. So I really also, being a descendant of those brought over here in transatlantic slavery, many people, their names were forcibly changed.
When you look at colonialism generally, and that the first thing taken away yes. is language, right? Yes. When places were colonized, it wasn't like, hey, let's change the way they dress, or let's change. They knew that if we change the way that the language that they speak, their culture within a generation or two will be gone, and they will now adopt ours, right? And so I love that. As I was listening and as I heard you, speak to it that way, it was very thought provoking, and I felt the significance.
Yeah. And, for many years, I would hide my name, Chika, like the African name my father gave me. You had to be a best friend or a family. And then a few years ago, I'm like, why? Like, the meaning is beautiful. Onleilove is cool as well. But I'm like, why am I hiding this? And then I started, using it, and it's connected me with so many Nigerian people. But my transition, so I was pretty... I was not raised in a church. I didn't know about the religious right. I didn't know certain things. I was just reading the Bible and praying on my own. And then when I went to college and I began to interact with like more religious right forms of Christianity, I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to hate this person. I'm supposed to think, and nothing ever settled. It did not settle with what I was reading, and also the complicity in certain parts of injustices didn't settle. So I did a lot of work for years with progressive Christians and evangelicals, writing, really trying to, some of us kind of saw the moment we're in now politically, and we were trying to do our best with conferences and books and training people on liberation theology and the liberative parts of scripture to prevent this religious movement that was given over to, I'm going to be blunt, like fascism and oppressing folks and making groups of people feel like God doesn't love them. And in that journey, and for, about 4 years, I studied liberation theology, starting with Black liberation theology. And I also was blessed to have some professors from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And when you study liberation theology, it's very heavy on the Tanakh, the Old Testament. And you begin to see like the Hebrew prophets, and you begin to see that the faith actually really starts with a family who's enslaved and then set free. And when I got out of seminary, I started to discover that there were many African tribes that prior to colonialism, Saturday was a day of rest and worship. So in Ghana, it was so common that when the colonialist missionaries came, the Ghana people said, we serve Saturday God and you all serve white God, which is Sunday God. So I started to find out about all these tribes that kept Sabbath, and I was kind of facing burnout as a young organizer. And I said, well, why don't I incorporate Sabbath? And then I began to study more of Torah, especially through the African Jewish lens. And I said, I still am a follower of Yeshua, but I am going to incorporate, the biblical feast, Passover, Hanukkah, Purim, and the Sabbath into my life. And I had a health crisis in 2012 without stress-induced allergies. It was I had to take a leave of absence from work at my job's urging. I realized if I didn't reorganize my life and make self-care a priority, I was going to burn out like so many organizers. There's so many organizers, even from the movement for Black Lives, that are just like young people who are not here with us anymore. So I really I say Sabbath saved my life. Like I went to get an allergy test in November. I have almost all my allergies are gone. And so I started looking to Torah and a more, Hebrew understanding of my faith. And so I don't see I see everything as one journey, and I'm still on a journey. So I'm sure that there's going to be even more that, as a spiritual person, that, changes that happen in my life. But that's kind of my transition to keeping Torah as a follower of Yeshua started in 2012, and I started visiting different synagogues in New York, but especially the historically Black synagogues that came out of the Commandment Keepers, which was one of the top African-American synagogues in New York City that was in Harlem, and then they split into 7 synagogues, which if you know anything about synagogues, that's very normal to have splits. And then I attended the oldest Messianic Hebrew assembly in New York City, which was started by Mother Helen Mickens. And today's the anniversary of her death. And she was an African-American woman who was a Pentecostal minister. And she wanted to start keeping Torah. And her bishop said, that's fine, but you can't do that here. So with her husband, in his storefront, they started Shabbat gatherings for African Americans in the Bronx. And then she founded a couple of congregations and connected with other Black women that were teaching themselves Torah. And one of those women founded Bethel Synagogue in Philadelphia and was ordained by a Sephardic rabbi. And I'm trying to do a book on those women's stories, but finding out about Mother Mickens and being a part of her family's congregation where there's African Americans, Africans, and Caribbeans keeping Torah has been really, was a really great part of my journey also. And I didn't realize, today is the anniversary of her passing, so I give her honor as well.
Serendipitous, right?
Real quick, Onleilove, you've mentioned Black liberation theology or liberation theology. For those of us who have heard of this but don't really know what it is, can you explain that real quick for us?
So there's a lot of misconceptions. So liberation theology, and there's a historically, there's a little discrepancy if Black liberation theology came first and then liberation theology with Gutierrez in South America came second, or vice versa. But Gutierrez was a Latin American theologian that really did these Bible studies with low-income people in South America, where you read the scriptures through their lens.
And what years are we talking with Gutierrez?
Like, see, this is where the beef comes. So this is all happening in like the 60s. And so Dr. James Cone wrote his first book, A Black Theology of Liberation. And so there's just, it was like really close to each other.
Okay.
And so, but Gutierrez is kind of the general liberation theologian. Dr. James Cone, focused on Black liberation theology, started writing his first book after Dr. King was assassinated. And really, it's looking at the scripture through the lens of the least of these, because the scriptures were written by, Hebrew scribes, which were a marginalized people. So like the Jewish people, really became a people after the whole ordeal with slavery in Egypt. And so you cannot really understand the message of the scriptures, whether it's the Hebrew Bible or the whole, or what people call Genesis to Revelation, if you're not reading it through the lens of the oppressed. You just cannot really understand it. Most of the prophets, including Yeshua, they are, talking about the oppressed, there's even a scripture in Amos that I use for my housing organizing in New York that says, like, if you charge unfair rent, God will judge you. I used to love saying that at City Hall, and you see people get scared, and then like all the housing activists are like, yes, even if they're atheists, they're like, wait. So liberation theology really helps you understand the context of the scriptures. So when like a good amount of the Hebrew Bible is written after the Egyptian captivity, after Babylonian exile, after Assyrian exile. When you get to the New Testament, they're under Greco-Roman domination, and there are literally books in the New Testament that are preparing the Hebrew people to deal with the fact that they're not going to have a temple anymore, which was just devastating because that was the center of their life. So liberation theology, there's a lot of assumptions about it, but it's basically reading the scriptures through the lens of the least of these. And then different marginalized groups can enter in, whether they're Latino, whether they're Black, whether they're women. You can, enter in because you realize that this canon of scripture it really has a message for those who, as Howard Thurman says, have their back up against the wall. That doesn't mean that privileged people can't enter in. All can enter in, but you have to realize that there was an original audience. And once I started reading the scriptures through that lens, I began to see, like, wait a minute, there are those who make people of color or even make Jews or make women feel like they're aside to the scriptures, but no, like we're actually central. And I want to say one thing when we're talking about who started liberation theology, Gutierrez or Dr. James Cone. In my research, I found out about a woman, she was super young, like maybe even under 25, named Kipa Vita. And she was a Congolese prophetess who now she is on record as starting the first Black theological movement for liberation, because in the 1600s, she actually preached that Jesus and all the people in the Bible were Black, that the Congolese people were the people of scripture, and she mobilized her people through those teachings to take on the colonialists in the Catholic Church. And she was burnt at the stake, and her bones were grinded to dust. Most of her founders were sold as slaves to Brazil. And you can look up Kipa Vita. And so now scholars are saying, we respect Gutierrez and Dr. Cone, but actually this young woman, I think she was like 18, 19, 20. Like, this young woman is actually technically the first like Black liberation theologian. And so that was someone I recently learned about and I'm trying to teach about. But liberation theology is also about letting marginalized people know that they can be agents in the world, that their faith and their spirituality can be empowering. And it's really trying to separate religion from, empire and power and how it's been used to really keep a lot of people in bondage. So that's a long explanation, but definitely I would encourage all your listeners to read God of the Oppressed by Dr. James Cone. That's the first book I read, and to look up Kimpa Vita, but she's a bad sister, so I like her. And the Catholic Church, I think, is trying to go back and make her a saint. The only thing is, it's just difficult to undo some things that you do.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that explanation.
You mentioned something before that you said Sabbath saved my life, and you were talking about the experience that you had where you literally had severe medical issues as a result of stress and being overwhelmed and overworking yourself and whatever it may have been. Can you so obviously there's the religious belief of Sabbath or Shabbat, right? Like the idea that there is a day of rest, and biblically it's, well, the world was created in 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested and took a break, and that's where it comes from. Some people do it on Saturday, some people do it on Sunday, and I understand all of that. So there's the religious side of it, but there's also just the physiological, biological, mental need that you have to rest. Just as we have to rest for, hopefully 7-8 hours a night, throughout the week. So talk me through what you learned and how specifically, maybe even just more of the details of how that break, that Sabbath, saved your life and changed things for you.
So if we remember around 2011, this is when we started having a lot of videotaped police killings of African Americans. And I was an organizer, and part of my portfolio began to be like mass incarceration and police brutality. And so every year there was a major, I had Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, just an onslaught. Number one, when we watch those videos of these police killings or any killing, it's traumatizing. Like, psychologists are finding out it's traumatizing. But as an organizer, you have to go into plan mode, rapid response, meetings, legislation, working. My friends who worked in Ferguson, there was no rest, maybe for some people for a year, 2 years, like every day in action. So when I started keeping Sabbath, that was when I went from being like an organizer at a nonprofit to actually running a federation of over 100 congregations representing 80,000 New Yorkers. And my first week, so fast forward, I'm 2 years into keeping Sabbath, or 1.5, and it's 2014, August, my first week as an ED, Mike Brown is killed. And we're sending, I was a part of an international network now called Faith in Action. And we're sending, people from all over the country to the ground in Ferguson. And I have friends who still have health problems from all the tear gas that was, sent to them. Sorry, I live in Manhattan, so that's the sounds of the city in the background.
I love that we're getting like sound effects that go with the story you're telling. It's like,
yes. Oh, that's true. And so, which makes what we saw in DC so painful, that those people were nothing was done to them. And they were planning sedition against the government, because I have friends who still have like respiratory problems from like tear gas in Ferguson. So when I started keeping Sabbath and I had to not work for a day, that actually helped me maintain my physical and my mental health. And I had this, like I said, stress-induced allergic attack that sent me to the emergency room. I was allergic to like a whole page of things. And, sometimes, not to get too technical, but when you're if your immune system's like overactive, that can lead to allergies. So just the resting one time a week And having that discipline, to me, I think it made me be able to last. And then it made me like think about all areas of my life and self-care. Now, when we think about Sabbath, it is true that we read about it at the beginning of creation in the Bible. But when we get to the Jewish people being led out of Egyptian slavery and they're in the wilderness and they're getting like the full Torah again, we have to think, if you were a newly freed enslaved person and you had no control over your work schedule, and now you're being told that the creator of the universe is giving you a day that you had to rest, this would be such a gift. And my family, was held here as slaves. I have ancestors who could not rest. My grandmother, who took me out of foster care as a young woman, picked cotton as a sharecropper. So for me, when I rest, it's like a radical, it's like I'm stopping, but I'm also making a radical stand that says my body as a Black woman is important and it deserves rest. And I'm not only what I can produce, I'm who I am. I have inherent worth, even if I'm not producing. And I understand that in this world, there are people who cannot do Sabbath, whether they're essential workers during COVID, whether they're people who are undocumented that also don't, they have to come to work whenever their boss tells them to. So we're not at a place where every single human being can have a day of rest, but I hope and pray for the day where we have that.
That perspective is so inspiring, to be able to look at your ancestry. I love that you said before that you are your ancestors and you're also your descendants, that you're just a little speck in this eternal realm of, everybody that came and everybody that's going. But to be able to look and say, my great, great, great grandmother, whoever it is, didn't have this ability, even though it's something that, you believe that is needed. And to be able to look at that and say, for that reason, as well as a plethora of other reasons, I'm going to, honor this day, and I'm going to honor this opportunity and this privilege and this ability that I have to give my body the rest. And also that you said that you have, it struck me that you have inherent worth as an individual, as a Black woman, as a human being, without producing, without the need to prove anything, but just to know that you are worth, that you have worth, that you are, however you look at that, that's inspiring and that's amazing. And that's a really good perspective as somebody who also keeps the Sabbath, like to look at it from that perspective and recognize that is awesome. Have you, this is kind of Josh will appreciate this question because he's interested in this as well. Have you seen The Chosen? Have you seen or heard anything about that series?
My friend has told me I need to see The Chosen.
Yeah, I'm sure
need to have
I'm sure that there's, I don't know if it's all in line with it, everything you believe in stuff, but it's the thing that I love about it. So it tells the story of Jesus from the perspective that you were talking about before. As somebody who my whole life I've seen videos of Jesus, or I've seen, portrayals of Jesus as this white, light-skinned guy that speaks with a British accent, or that speaks exactly how things are written, for behold, lo unto the, I highly doubt that was exactly, that's not what we know or believe. And so obviously there's different levels of what you believe that to have looked like and felt like. The thing about The Chosen is that it tells the portrayal of Jesus as a poor man who was under Roman rule, who was living in the society where he was nothing, where he, and it tells the story of him going and finding and gathering his apostles, and who were also nothing, who were burdened and overburdened with taxes and unable to pay, and it really gives you the sense of the time in a way that I've never seen or felt. And again, I'm sure there's plenty of inconsistencies, but it makes a huge leap and stride from any content I've taken in the past, telling this story. I think you'd really enjoy it. It also they speak with a, more of an Arabic accent. They're actors that are really good at that. They're also darker skinned and look like they're from the Middle East and don't look, again, with some inconsistencies, but for the most part, yeah, you should watch it. I think it'd be fascinating for you and good to see. Tell us about Prophetic Whirlwind. That's the name of the book that's been referenced multiple times. It's called Prophetic Whirlwind. And we've talked about this kind of broadly, but your ministry is dedicated, as from your bio, is dedicated to uncovering the African roots of the Bible, combating gender violence, and supporting African Jews, right? I think that's a pretty good synopsis of a lot of the work that you've done. What is the book, Prophetic Whirlwind, about? Maybe a little more, I know we've touched on it a little bit, but more in depth.
So Prophetic Whirlwind Ministries, the mission has been stretched. I was unaware that like Prophetic Whirlwind, the book, would touch like so many people. I mean, I've been asked to minister in Indian ministries, Pakistani ministries, European synagogues. So, we are really, it's a ministry for everyone to come into this journey of looking at the scriptures through a Black lens, and primarily through the lens of Jews in Africa. So when many think of Jews in Africa, they think of Ethiopians. But because there's so much great work on Ethiopian Jews, and I hope if COVID is like not what it is now, I hope that I will take my first trip to Ethiopia this August. But I wanted to hone in on Central, Western, and Southern African Jews because they don't get as much attention. And so Prophetic Whirlwind, Uncovering the Black Biblical Destiny, actually profiles 15 tribes and ethno-linguistic groups throughout Africa that have connections to what some people call the lost tribes of Israel, who are basically Jews who are separated from the rest of the diaspora. And they're, reappearing. They've never gone anywhere because, God can't lose people. We may lose people and we may lose ourselves. But as far as the public and academic, awareness, they're reappearing and reconnecting to to the rest of their brothers and sisters. And so I cover some of my travels to Ghana and Nigeria to visit Igbo congregations that are Torah keeping, to visit Sefwi Jews of Ghana, my time in Israel with African Jews. And so I uncover, it's kind of like some parts are my travels, but a lot of parts are the history. And then I turn to African Americans and I uncover some, history about African American Jews. But then because I am an organizer, I'm saying, what does this mean for justice for Black lives today? And we really look at the Torah-based principles of justice, that you can, anytime you have injustice, you will have idolatry. Anytime you have idolatry, you will have injustice. What does this mean looking forward for doing justice in our community? What does this mean for combating racism and anti-Semitism? And so that has, and I have a charity called Operation Joseph with Hebrew Nation Building. And it's basically where anyone can donate, but we really did crowdfunding among African American, mostly millennials, to send funds to African Jews, but not as charity, but as family helping family. So to date, we've helped almost 60 African synagogues, NGOs, orphanages that are, run by African Hebrews. And I think everyone, if you're listening and you donated to Operation Joseph, we truly appreciate you. But what I'm doing is uncovering these hidden stories. And I love this idea of, the 12 tribes of Israel were a family. And because of exile, they were scattered and divided.
The 12 tribes of Israel were the sons of who? I'm trying to remember. I should know this.
So they were the sons of Jacob, Rachel, Leah, and their two handmaids. So it was a little bit of a messy family. I get into that with my work around gender equality, but it was Jacob.
Okay, so the sons of Jacob, there were 10 or 12. I should know.
There were 12. Well, there were 12 sons, but one tribe, Joseph, his two sons became like half tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. And then Dinah, we don't want to forget the daughter who was a victim of rape. She's not counted her descendants are not like recognized in the 12 tribes, but I just like to shout her out as well. There was one daughter. So this family always had drama. Okay. Some people have one mom. I mean, there's one dad and 4 moms. So there's already drama and divisions. I'm giving y'all the quick, fast, Real Housewives of the Bible version.
RHOB.
Yes. So there's already divisions. Unfortunately, when King Solomon sets out to build the temple that's supposed to be for God, he ends up enslaving some of his brothers and sisters to build that temple. Well, mostly brothers. And different Old Testament academics have brought this out, looking at the Hebrew language. So there's kind of resentment and bitterness between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom are Judah, the kings, Levi, the priest, and Benjamin, the little brother. And so already, there is a division. Some people in the northern kingdom want to have their own local temples. They don't want to go to the temple in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, in the midst of this division, Assyria invades and takes away most of the 10 tribes of Israel, with a few being left in the land. And then the prophets, they warned about this. So they start warning Judah. Levi and Benjamin the nobles get taken into Babylonian captivity. And that's where we encounter like the book of Esther. We're about to celebrate Purim. She helped her people from a genocide, because there's the Babylonian captivity, and then there's also the Persian captivity, like back to back. But King Cyrus lets some of the southern kingdom come back. There is a lot that goes on, unfortunately. Go ahead hundreds, thousands of years. Now we're dealing with Greece and Rome. So the first 10 tribes get scattered when the Assyrian Empire falls, and many go into Africa, the Middle East. But we forget
they're literally getting scattered because they're being taken away. These different groups are being taken away as slaves to different parts all over the world, right? That's the scattering.
And then even when Assyria falls, you would think, why didn't they go back to Israel? But many, years had passed that many have forgotten. So some run into Africa, India. There's, groups of Jews in India. Literally, I have people contacting me from Fiji, Papua New Guinea, that are like, they have oral histories of being Jews. So it's like amazing. And so, okay, we get to the Babylonian captivity. Some people come back. We have, many years of prophets warning. We have Yeshua coming. And then we have in 70 AD and even like 100 AD, like Greece and Rome invading. In 70 AD, the temple is destroyed for the last time. Millions are killed. Some are starved to death. In 100 AD, more, happens. And then we have like what remains of the Jews in Israel scattering to different places around the world. Now with Africans, there's a something called the reverse exodus. The first exodus is from Egypt to Israel. Now, many people don't know Israel and Egypt were physically connected until the Suez Canal was constructed was finished in 1869.
I heard you talk about this on something I watched, and it was, again, this is somebody, as a religious person who studied this and should know a lot more than I do, but it hadn't even registered to me. And I heard you say that, and I immediately Googled like map of Africa, and I was like, oh yeah, there's just a little thin strip of land that separates Egypt from Israel. But historically, and you mentioned this, and this goes to a lot of that, I can't think of the word, but the way that we're trained to think, or the way that we look at this, and whether it's racial or whether it's whatever, is, well, no, Africa's Africa and Israel is Israel. And those are two different places. Africans are African, you know what I mean? But when you look at a map, you're like, oh no, that's like going from Utah into Colorado or something. It's like crossing the border,
you could get a bus.
Yeah.
And we look at Madagascar, which does not touch the continent of Africa.
Way down south. Yeah.
And I love those brothers and sisters there. And they definitely have people of African descent there, but we count that as Africa. But Israel, until the Suez Canal was built, touched Africa, and we don't count that.
Which was just a man-made decision to build something. Yeah, it's not, there's...
For war and commerce. The Suez Canal was built for war and commerce. So often when the Jewish people were under pressure or war, they would run from Israel into Egypt to the point where Elephantine, Egypt, at one time had about 300,000 Jews. But Egypt was also constantly invaded. And so many tribes in Africa that have Hebrew origins, they talk about the different reasons why they migrated further into Africa. But they didn't migrate overnight. It took hundreds of years. The Limba, who were proven by DNA analysis from Oxford University, and they were, there's a Discovery Channel documentary about the Limba Jews. They always talked about how they migrated from Israel to Yemen to Ethiopia, all the way to South Africa and Zimbabwe. No one believed them. And then finally, DNA testing was done, and this explorer retraced their footsteps and saw that their migration route was possible, that Sina, the city they said they lived in Yemen, actually exists. And Professor Tudor Parfit at Florida Atlantic University has done a great amount of work on African Jews and worked to bring the Limba out. He was also a part of Operation Moses, which airlifted the Ethiopian Jews to Israel. But they DNA tested for the highest incident of the Cohen gene out of any group of Jewish men. And that is the gene that people say it goes all the way back to Moses and his brother Aaron. So they're Levites, and I've been honored to dialogue with some Limba Cohens. And so that has been pretty cool. And there are some African Americans that are DNA testing Limba. I actually know two pastors who are cousins, and they, have very thriving ministries, and they did DNA testing, and they both had Limba DNA. And so they're being welcomed by some of the Limba elders that when they're able to travel, they're going to go and formally be welcomed back. But I said, wow, that is so cool. You all are Levites. So
it's amazing. And to think, the common story of a migration from well, I guess Nazareth into Egypt is Jesus. After Jesus was born, and is it King Herod that's like, hey, we're gonna anybody under the age of 2 or whatever, we're gonna kill them all. Let's restart this. I got to find this guy. And Joseph and Mary are like, hey, let's go to. There's a migration right there to Egypt, and so to think that was an isolated incident, that they just thought of this idea, would be naive. I guess I've never thought about it this way, but I'm guessing that was a fairly common thing in the times, is to say, well, if you're going to migrate, head south down to Egypt. It's so that makes sense. Something that's intriguing to me, a couple of weeks ago we interviewed a woman named Basila Bokoko. She's from Spain. She's born in Spain and raised in Spain, but is of African descent, and I can't remember the country that her family. It's something Guinea.
New Guinea.
It's not. I can't remember. Is
it Cape Verde?
No, I'll have to look it up. We'll go back and fact check it. It's somewhere. It's a Guinea in Africa. I can't remember, but they speak Spanish. The only place in Africa.
Equatorial Guinea.
There you go. Equatorial Guinea. Yep. So her family, her ancestry is from there. Her parents, as young adults or maybe even teenagers, migrated to Spain. And anyway, so we talked to her about her experience. She's now a very successful entrepreneur. She was the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce for Spain and the US, and there in Manhattan. She's awesome. But one of the things we talked about was her experience. I think at the age of 34, for her 34th birthday, she gave her the gift of going back to Africa. And she went to, I want to say Ghana, which isn't where that's not where her ancestry was from. Nevertheless, it was close. And we talked about her experience going to a place where the people looked like her. And she just noticed, even though she wasn't from there, these cultural connections that were just in the DNA of these people who were close to, and so my question, I guess, after that huge preamble there, is, as you've those cousin ministers, for example, or yourself or others who in down in Zimbabwe, these people that have this DNA in them that says, well, no, you were from another place. Do you sense, and if you can explain it, that would be great. Maybe it's inexplicable, but this connection that these people have that you would think they wouldn't, because they born, raised in a different culture, in a different place, and in most cases a different language. Nevertheless, there is a connection that they have, and almost like a wisdom or an understanding, or is that something that you see and that you felt? Explain that.
Yeah, so when I did my research on the ground and just academically, most of these tribes keep Torah, even if they did not have the Torah scroll. So like the Sefwi Jews kept Sabbath, they farmed, you let the lamb rest every 7 years, circumcising boys at 8 days old, the Igbo circumcising boys at 8 days old, mikvahs after certain periods of impurity. I mean, you can go through every tribe I write about has Torah practices that are embedded into their pre-colonial culture. So you have to really know Torah well. Like in Leviticus, there is a drink for a woman accused of adultery. And so I know some of the feminist sisters, they may not like that story, but it is a drink where if a man thinks his wife is committing adultery, they go to the temple, the Levite makes this drink, she drinks it. If her stomach and thighs it blow up, she's guilty of adultery or whatever. The Igbos and the Ashantis of Ghana until recent history did that for women accused of adultery. Now we could talk about all the implications, or what about the man that's in, my second book is going to be Prophetic World when uncovering the woman's biblical destiny. So we could get into all the implications, but I share that to say that's one of the many Torah-based traditions that these tribes in Africa are still keeping. The Limba even constructed their own Ark of the Covenant that was lost, and it was found in a basement of a South African museum. There are so many. I mean, even certain tribes in their language, they have words that are Hebrew and mean the same thing. Or festivals that are Passover, like the Gadami of Ghana have their Homowo festival where they put, lamb's blood on the door, and they celebrate not only their exodus from Egypt to Israel, but also their exodus across the continent to Ghana, where they found safety. So part of my work has been studying the Torah so I can know the different practices, and then comparing it to these different tribes that say they have this connection.
This may be a naive question, but when you say keeping, so you've got oral histories, which a lot of that I think comes from, right? Like an oral history being passed down from generation to generation to generation, and these traditions that are so rich, and that then you can trace back and say, oh, you're doing this in 2012 or whatever, and in 70 AD they did this. Those two things are very similar with and that's an oral history. When you say keeping Torah, does that just mean that it's written down? Is it journaling basically? Is it?
When I say keeping Torah, I'm referring to many of the Levitical practices that we find in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then not necessarily rabbinical Judaism, which came later with Maimonides and different rabbinical sages from the first century. So there are some tribes in Africa that even keep rabbinical traditions, like the washing of the hands. And then there are some tribes that have no knowledge of that, because either they're from those 10 tribes that were taken away earlier, or they were not, in Jerusalem when the Talmud was written. So I'm mostly referring to the actual Torah, the first 5 books of scripture, and different traditions that you find there. Now, there are some that when you read the rabbinical writings, because that is based on oral history, even if it was written in the first century, a lot of times it comes from the oral, histories that the Hebrews passed down. You may find some African tribes who do that. And because you mentioned the sister from Spain, another very sad way that Jews got to Africa is the Inquisition. So there is a branch of the Yoruba people called, strange people in Yoruba language, and they actually came from were expelled. Like some people, when they were expelled, they just migrated further into Africa to places like Cape Verde. Angola was sometimes kind of a prison colony where Jewish children were sent during the Inquisition. In this little branch of the Yoruba, they speak Landingo, and that is a mix of Spanish and Hebrew. So I do have some colleagues that are doing research on African Jews and the Inquisition. I started to encounter some of that, but it is a lot to delve into. But I do want to acknowledge that some people actually made their way to Morocco and different parts of Africa just trying to, outrun the Inquisition. And many Jewish children were taken at like 2 and 3 years old and sent to places like Cape Verde until they were old enough to serve and to be sold into slavery. So, in America, we have these racial constructs that are about 500 years old. In your Bible, you won't read Black or white. You won't read Asian or yellow or Native American. You will read names of tribes and families. So some people may be like, well, the Jews near me are not Black, or, I've really had to come out of this like 500-year-old racial classification. And in scripture, it says they would be scattered to the four corners of the earth. So thinking about the whole concept of family being bigger than, well, you don't look just like me, that is something that I think this story also, tells. But the Inquisition also played a huge role. And it was a very horrible injustice that I hope at some point there's recognition, because I've encountered people from Portugal, from so many places that have said my work resonates with them because their family, ended up in Portugal because of the Inquisition, even if they're not, the same color as me.
Man, I feel like I could talk to you all day. I love this stuff. I think what I'm hearing and what the thoughts that keep coming to me as we're discussing this is we have a way of looking at our lives and the world that we live in within the realm of a couple hundred years history max, right? United States, 1776, boom, like that, let's work from there. But there is so much more history, and there are so many over the generations and the centuries, just the different lenses that people saw the world through, and the way that they made decisions and stuff based off of that. When you look at it with that perspective, it makes you feel small, but in a good way. It makes you feel like, okay, this is one part of a real big picture here, and they figured it out before. I think we can figure it out again. So my next question is that you said earlier that justice leads to idolatry and idolatry leads to injustice. When you said that, it makes me think of the state of things politically right now in the U.S., right? The whatever your belief system is, and however you define idolatry or wickedness or whatever it is, like the amount of corruption is the word that usually is drain the swamp or whatever, the amount of corruption that we see politically there's no hiding from it. Again, it doesn't matter what your belief systems are, it doesn't matter where your baseline is, you can find what we would and so that leads, it seems to have led, and again, we're not a political podcast, I'm not getting into any real deep politics or anything, but it's led to injustice. And wherever there's injustice, that leads to this, it's a cycle, right? Of exactly what you said. You are somebody, more than we've talked to anybody else, and probably more than I've spoken with anybody who's on the ground as an activist, who as a organizer, who's been a part of these movements over the last number of years, and who we seem, and I hope we're at some getting close to some climactic moment of let's fix some things and let's be better. Where do you find hope when you're in the thick of it? And when you're looking at the future, you're looking at a year from now and 5 years from now and 10 years from now, because it really is easy to just throw your hands up and say, I think we're done. I think we messed it up. Where do you find hope for the future? And then I guess as a follow-up question to that, and this is more of a religious, or a theological question, but being somebody that, that believes and has read and is an expert on the Bible and stuff, where does, and this is just an opinion thing, you don't even have to answer if you don't want to, but when you look at like the prophecies from Revelations and Daniel and stuff that are saying, like, that are preparing the world for some sort of apocalyptic scenario, as it pertains to the end of the world, and whether you're Jewish or Christian or whatever, you believe that something's going to happen. I guess where does that, in your mind, and I know it's probably based on opinion, experience, whatever, but where does that fit into all of this? That's two big, huge questions, but hopefully, if anybody's going to be able to handle it, it's you.
Oh boy. So those are big questions. So
answer all of our questions.
So I definitely gained hope from my faith and from, reading the scripture through the eyes of a just God. There's a verse from Psalms that says, righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. So, I firmly believe like God is not in the building of empires. He builds kingdoms. He didn't even want the Hebrew people to have a king. He really didn't want the temple. These are things he let them have because they wanted to be like the other nations. And so we have to realize that every empire has its, ascent and its decline, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Babylon, Assyria, Greece, Rome. And so just because, America may be going through a decline doesn't mean the end of America is not the end of the world. And I'm not saying America is ending. I'm very careful with what I say, but I think I get my hope from, my faith that says that God is always going to take care of the oppressed, of the least of these, and of those who want to join his family and his plan. And so I also gain hope from, even the story of, Jews in Africa, how, these people have survived, conquest, Inquisition, slavery, so many different things, but you can still hold on to your family and your culture. I think, when we think about idolatry, we think about a statue and people bowing down. What we don't understand in ancient cultures, there were always practices behind the idol, whether it was sexually exploitative practices, Baal worship involved like money and greed, and people go downtown in my city of New York and they rub a bull. And the way we talk about the market, we talk about it as a spirit. And we, put that over people and places. And I'm not against the market. I will invest in the stock market, but everything has to have its place. So when you begin to worship something that's created and not the creator, you begin to be able to dehumanize others. So people could enslave my ancestors because they did not fear the God who created us and who created them too. And money became more of a God than the human lives of those they enslaved. So I really take a lot of hope from my faith, from reading the prophets. And this goes into the second question. When we read the book of Revelation or even Daniel, which there is a connection, we do hear about this statue that represents different empires that will fall, but we also read about a kingdom, a new heaven, a new earth. And so we have to realize that no country, no person, no family can continue to go on the way that, we are going on in this country. And so as painful as it is, we have to have some of this stuff revealed. We have to have the covers come off of the greed or the racism or the anti-Semitism or, the white supremacy. Many have made an idol of racism. Many have made an idol of nationalism, where we talked a lot about Jews who migrated, and everyone's probably like, wow, that's cool. But what if Ghana didn't welcome the Sekwe people when they migrated? Ghana actually has a couple of tribes that are connected or Hebrew in origin, because prior to colonialism, Ghana had a lot of religious tolerance. What if, different cultures would not have welcomed people fleeing the Inquisition? But we don't welcome migrants today. Even though, our own savior, Yeshua, and his family had to be migrants to save his life. And so we couldn't keep going on the way we were going on. And so as painful as this is to watch, I think we can truly get to the bottom of the inequality and racism in this culture, because everything is being put on Front Street. Now, many people see that what Black folks were saying was true. We saw folks participating in an attempted coup, and everyone got to go home safe, and even some police taking selfies with them. And then you see peaceful protesters who are Black, and they have rubber bullets, people getting killed, people getting locked up, pepper spray. So now we're seeing the inequality in our justice system. So I think apocalypse actually doesn't mean like the end of the earth. It means the revealing of things that were hidden. Actually, when you look at the biblical definition. So what is happening now is a lot of what was hidden and only known by the marginalized in society is becoming known by everyone. Now, anytime God puts you in a chaos situation and in a crisis, you have two ways to respond. I believe in free will. I mean, it's in scripture. So either people in this country are going to lean into what this moment is trying to teach us and move forward into that new heaven and new earth, or they're going to stay stuck in this kind of empire mentality and maybe get left behind. The Left Behind movies and books put so much fear in like our hearts when we watch them. But when you think about what the kingdom of Yahweh is going to be like, it's going to be based on righteousness and justice. And if you're going to stay stuck in hatred, stay stuck in nationalism, stay stuck in worshiping white supremacy, you may not be fit for the future that God is calling us to. So this is a painful time to watch, but I am hopeful because I know that there is an ultimate plan for justice to reign. And even if we talk about end of the world prophecies among Jewish people, it is thought when the lost tribes of Israel come back on the scene, that we are closer to the Messiah coming. Among Christians, old school Christians, it used to be when the lost tribes of Israel start to appear, we're closer to the return of Christ, of Yeshua. So in my research, I also have hope that as these tribes reappear on the world scene, that we're getting closer to the messianic age where we can live in righteousness, and that God just wants us to prepare through being disciples of Yeshua. So that's something I have to remind myself of. The fact is, what we saw last Wednesday was already there. And so we can't cure what we don't face. And so now we have to face it. And just, people need to take care of themselves and be safe, and really also think like, what am I idolizing? If you still don't think that it's not about voting for one person above the other, but it's about, people were making prophecies about the presidential election that kind of helped fuel this. So as a minister, I've been sitting with, you cannot open your mouth and say, God says, but it's based on your own preferences. And so we have a lot to reckon with, but I think for those who will actually face it, it will be a better reality. But if there are those who don't want to face it, you kind of get left behind, so to speak.
Preach. That's all I have to say. I genuinely feel love for you as a sister. I'll tell you that right now. Like after watching your videos and seeing what you've done and then talking to you today, I feel a connection and a bond. Not just because it's you, but just for anybody, for everybody, right? To I don't know, just hearing you express yourself and talk and the work that you've put in. I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear from you and learn from you. And I genuinely want myself, for myself, but for anybody listening to this, to have opportunities to hear more from you and to learn more from you. And so where I know there's the book, which we've talked about, Prophetic Whirlwind. propheticwhirlwind.com is the website. Where else I think you have a podcast, right? And I tried to pull it up last night and then it wasn't working and I had to watch a YouTube video. So tell us everywhere that we can find you and hear from you and learn from you.
Well, thank you, Corey, for having me on. This has been one of the coolest interviews. Thank you, Josh, as well. You can connect with me at propheticwhirlwind.com. Also on Instagram and Facebook at Prophetic Whirlwind, and YouTube at Prophetic Whirlwind. And I do tweet a little bit at Prophetic Whirl. And the book is Prophetic Whirlwind, Uncovering the Black Biblical Destiny. But Prophetic Whirlwind Ministries, we actually have different programs where we pray together once a week, where we celebrate the biblical feasts, like we will be doing something for Purim. Tomorrow, we will be celebrating New Jewish Month, which is called Rosh Chodesh. So there's a lot of, now everything is virtual. There are a lot of virtual community building programs you can participate in. And the programming is welcoming to everyone. So I want everyone to know that. Sometimes men think, oh, can I come on? Yes, men can come. White, Black, Indian, everyone can come on and just fellowship and have a little moment of hope. We are trying to create virtual spaces so we can still fellowship. Also, the Practical Torah podcast is on iTunes, and that's where I give a reflection on the weekly Torah portion from kind of a Black perspective, and also just how can you use it in your everyday life. So those are some places you can connect with me. And I love to meet new folks. And hopefully when I'm able to travel, I will be in a city near you. But it's been a pleasure. And I just want everyone to remember that the same person who created the sun, moon, and stars created you and loves you and wants to have a personal relationship with you. And that is something that I take a lot of hope in.
I just want to say thank you. I think one of the things that's come out of this interview, Onleilove, is that there are people out there who profit from dividing us, and yet there's more that unites us than what divides us. Yes. And I've been studying some of the anti-racism literature lately, reading Ta-Nehisi and Cornel West, and I just read Malcolm X's biography and Frantz Fanon and a lot of this stuff. And I'm like, this isn't what I've been told to expect in these books. I actually agree with 97% of what's in here, which is as much as you can agree with anybody. Yeah. And so even though there might be this 3% of things that we disagree with, I think most of us agree on the main points, but somehow we get divided on those tiny little details. And that's one of the things that I love that came out of this chat together today, is that as we're talking, it's, here and there might be a little tiny something that, maybe we could discuss, but 97% of it, we're on the same page.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. We have to look at what unites us and not so much what divides us. And sometimes I don't agree with 3% of what I said last year. If you're growing, you shouldn't agree with everything you think as an individual. But what is really going to hold us together in this time? And what is really the point of this whole journey? So thank you, Josh.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Onleilove.
Thank you so much. I definitely appreciate that. And I will be sharing this interview. And it's been a blessing being with you all. And I will definitely be in touch. Okay. And I just hope that you all are safe. And I'm going to try to stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe.
You're welcome. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello, it's Corey here, and I just want to thank you so much for listening into the Hope Strategy podcast. I hope you're enjoying it as much as we are enjoying having these amazing conversations with these incredible individuals talking about hope. We'd love it if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing, and leaving us a review on iTunes or Spotify or anywhere that you listen to your podcasts, and share it with anybody you feel that can benefit from these messages of hope. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy podcast.